A state is not given on a silver platter. He knew this in his bones. In 1948, as invading armies vowed to destroy Israel at birth, one commander stood in their way. With brilliant deception and audacious speed, his young soldiers redrew the map of their country in battle. They secured the north and conquered the south, giving their nation borders and breadth. Yet the man who won the war would discover his most bitter fight was not for land, but for his place in the nation he saved. Your support matters. Like, subscribe, and leave one comment. Thank you. Yigal Allon was born Yigal Paikovich in the village of Kfar Tavor, a small Jewish settlement nestled in the sweeping landscapes of the lower Galilee. The year was 1918. His parents were pioneers, part of the Second Aliyah, a wave of immigrants who had left behind the persecution of Eastern Europe for the ancient promise of their ancestral homeland. They were not dreamers in the abstract sense. They were builders, their hands calloused from turning rocky soil into fertile farmland. Life on the Moshav was a testament to their resolve, a daily cycle of grueling labor under a relentless sun. For young Yigal, this was the only world he knew. His earliest memories were not of city streets, but of the scent of turned earth, the rhythm of the harvest, and the profound, almost spiritual connection to the land his family tilled. This upbringing forged in him the quintessential identity of the Sabra. The term, taken from the native prickly pear cactus, described a new generation of Jews born in the land of Israel, tough and thorny on the outside, but sweet and tender on the inside. Allon embodied this ideal. He was pragmatic, self-reliant, and spoke Hebrew not as a revived ancient tongue, but as his mother language. His education was twofold. In the classroom, he studied history and literature, but in the fields, he learned the more vital lessons of survival, endurance, and the unyielding realities of nature. The Moshav was more than a farm. It was a community bound by a shared fate, where every family depended on the other for their very existence. This communal bond instilled in him a powerful sense of responsibility that would define his entire life. The beauty of the Galilee, however, was deceptive. It was a landscape steeped in a constant, low-level tension that could erupt into violence without warning. The threat was not a distant headline, it was the sound of a rustle in the dark beyond the settlement's fence, the sight of smoke on a distant hill. His parents taught him a fundamental truth that became the bedrock of his worldview, a principle they lived by every day. This land, they impressed upon him, is ours not just to farm, but to protect. The plow and the rifle were two sides of the same coin, inseparable tools for building a Jewish future. The necessity of self-defense was not a political ideology. It was as essential as the rain for the crops. This early lesson, learned through the quiet determination in his father's eyes, shaped the boy into the man he would become. The abstract threat became a brutal reality during the Arab revolts of the 1930s. The violence that swept across Palestine reached the very doorstep of Kfar Tavor. Ambushes on the roads, attacks on isolated farms, and the constant fear of raids transformed the landscape of his youth into a front line. For a teenager like Yigal, joining the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense organization, was not a choice. It was an inevitable, unspoken duty, a rite of passage for his entire generation. He enlisted at the age of 16, his farmer's hands learning to handle a rifle with the same familiarity as a hoe. The transition from cultivating the land to guarding it was seamless, a natural extension of his existence. He was no longer just a son of the soil, he was its sworn defender. His first duties were the unglamorous, nerve-wracking tasks of a sentry. Night patrols became his new reality. He would lie for hours in the darkness, every sense on high alert, distinguishing the sound of the wind from the snap of a twig that could signal an approaching attacker. On one such night, cloaked in the deep black of the Galilee, a sound in the distance made his heart pound. It was a moment of stark clarity, the true weight of his responsibility settling upon him. The lives of everyone in the settlement, his family and friends, rested on his vigilance. In these tense, silent hours, early signs of his innate leadership began to surface. He calmed the younger recruits, organized the watch rotations with quiet authority, and demonstrated a cool-headedness that belied his years. This was his first raw classroom of command. His natural aptitude did not go unnoticed. The Haganah leadership saw in this young farmer a spark of military genius, and he was soon introduced to a figure who would revolutionize Jewish military thinking: British Captain Ord Wingate. Wingate was a charismatic, eccentric, and fiercely pro-Zionist officer who despised the passive, defensive posture of the Jewish settlements. He believed in taking the fight to the enemy. Allon was selected for Wingate's elite unit, the Special Night Squads. Under Wingate's tutelage, he learned the art of unconventional warfare. They abandoned the static defense of the fence line, instead launching aggressive, preemptive raids deep into hostile territory under the cover of darkness. It was a radical and dangerous new doctrine, teaching Allon the value of surprise, initiative, and the psychological impact of offensive action. If Wingate was his tactical instructor, another man became his spiritual and strategic mentor, Yitzhak Sadeh. Known affectionately as the Old Man, Sadeh was a founder of the Palmach, the Haganah's elite strike force, and a revered figure in the Jewish community. He saw in Allon not just a skilled fighter, but a future commander. Sadeh's philosophy was simple yet profound. He taught that a commander must always lead from the front, sharing every risk and hardship with his soldiers. He preached the importance of fostering initiative, trusting his men to think for themselves on the battlefield. For Allon, who had lost his own father at a young age, Sadeh became a paternal figure, guiding his development and instilling in him the ethos of leadership that would become his hallmark. The combination of these influences was transformative. The deep connection to the land from his Moshav childhood provided the motivation. The harsh realities of the Arab revolts provided the experience. Ord Wingate provided the tactical ferocity, and Yitzhak Sadeh provided the moral and strategic compass. He was no longer simply Yigal Allon, the farmer's son from Kfar Tavor. He was becoming Yigal Allon, a commander forged in the crucible of the Galilee, a synthesis of soil and strategy. This raw talent, forged in the fields of the Galilee and tempered by the best unconventional military minds of the era, was about to find its ultimate expression in the creation of a new, elite fighting force that would change the course of Jewish history. As the storm clouds of a world war gathered, a new kind of warrior was being forged in the fields and groves of Palestine. In 1941, Yigal Allon became a founding member of the Palmach, the elite strike companies of the Haganah. This was not to be a conventional army. It was a revolutionary concept, a fusion of farmer and fighter, pioneer and soldier. Members lived and worked on kibbutzim, their days divided between agricultural labor that hardened their bodies and paid for their keep, and intense military training that sharpened their minds. Allon was central to shaping this unique identity. He believed that the land could only be held by those who worked it, and that the best soldiers were those fighting for a home they had built with their own hands. He cultivated an atmosphere of radical informality, a stark departure from the rigid hierarchies of every other military force in the world. There were no formal ranks, no saluting, no parade ground discipline. Commanders were known by their first names. This was a deliberate strategy to foster deep camaraderie and empowered junior leaders to seize the initiative without waiting for orders. A commander's authority came from respect earned in the field, not from a patch sewn on a uniform. This ethos created an unbreakable bond among the fighters, a sense of shared purpose that transcended military duty. It was a culture best captured by their own unofficial motto, a sentiment Allon championed with every action. As one member would later recall, "We were a family first, an army second." This family was becoming the Jewish community's sharpest sword. Allon's ascent within this new force was meteoric. His natural leadership, calm under pressure, and brilliant tactical mind were impossible to ignore. His mentor, the grizzled Haganah commander Yitzhak Sadeh, saw in him a rare prodigy, once remarking that Allon was one of the greatest natural military talents he had ever seen. This was not empty praise. It was a clear-eyed assessment of a young man who seemed born to lead. By 1945, at an age when most men were just beginning their careers, Yigal Allon was appointed commander-in-chief of the Palmach. He was in his mid-20s, now holding the reins of the Yishuv's most potent weapon. The weight of this responsibility was immense. The Palmach was the shield and spear of a nation in waiting, and its fate rested on his young shoulders. Allon did not flinch. Instead, he doubled down on the doctrines he had helped create. He instilled a philosophy of mobile warfare, emphasizing speed, surprise, and nocturnal operations to offset their numerical and material inferiority. He taught his commanders to think independently, to adapt, and to improvise. Above all, he cemented the principle of leading by example. In the Palmach, commanders always went first, facing the same dangers as their soldiers. This was Allon's creed, and it forged a force of unparalleled morale and daring. His leadership was soon put to its ultimate test. As the British administration enforced cruel restrictions on Jewish immigration, turning away ships of Holocaust survivors, the Haganah decided a powerful message had to be sent. Allon was tasked with planning and executing a nationwide operation of unprecedented scale and audacity. The plan was codenamed Operation Night of the Bridges. The objective was simple yet breathtakingly ambitious: to simultaneously destroy 11 key bridges connecting Palestine to its neighbors, severing the British Army's main supply routes in a single coordinated blow. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the British Empire. The night of June 16, 1946, was thick with tension. In a secret command post, Allon stood over a map of Palestine, a single light illuminating the pins that marked each target. He had spent weeks meticulously planning every detail, from the composition of the sabotage teams to the precise timing of the explosions. His commanders, young men he had trained and trusted, were now moving silently through the darkness toward their objectives across the country. They were striking deep inside territory controlled by one of the world's mightiest armies. The risks were enormous. Discovery meant a firefight, capture, or death. As the designated hour approached, the silence in the command room was absolute. Allon waited, his face a mask of concentration. This was the culmination of everything the Palmach had been built for: precision, stealth, and collective courage. Then the reports began to trickle in over the crackling radio. One by one, from the north to the south, his commanders confirmed their success. The Allenby Bridge over the Jordan River was down. The railway bridge at Akziv was a wreck of twisted steel. 10 of the 11 targets were destroyed in a near-flawless display of operational genius. The Night of the Bridges was a stunning success. It sent a shockwave through the British administration and announced to the world that the Jewish community in Palestine possessed a sophisticated and determined military force. It cemented the legend of the Palmach as an unstoppable shadow army and established Yigal Allon's reputation as a brilliant and fearless commander. He had outmaneuvered a global superpower with planning, audacity, and the unwavering loyalty of the soldiers he called family. Having proven his ability to outwit the British, Allon would soon face an even greater challenge: a multi-front war for the very survival of the nascent state, beginning with a desperate battle for the soul of the Galilee. The spring of 1948 was a time of desperate improvisation. As the British mandate dissolved into chaos, the fate of the newly declared state hung by a thread. Nowhere was the threat more immediate than in the north. The eastern Galilee, a land of ancient hills and kibbutzim, was on the verge of being swallowed whole. Syrian and Lebanese-backed Arab forces, well-armed and confident, were closing in, threatening to sever the entire region from the nascent country. Control of the Galilee depended on one critical point: a city perched high in the mountains, a place of mystics and stone alleys. Safed. Its strategic high ground commanded the surrounding valleys and roads. To hold Saft was to hold the north. The situation within the city was catastrophic. A small, besieged Jewish quarter, numbering less than 2,000 souls, was surrounded by over 10,000 Arabs. The defenders were a mix of Haganah fighters and local residents, their ammunition dwindling, their hope fading with each passing hour. The numerically superior Arab force, bolstered by units of the Arab Liberation Army, was tightening its grip, preparing for a final decisive assault. An air of impending doom settled over the ancient city. If Saft fell, the road into the heart of Jewish settlement in the Galilee would be wide open. The entire northern front would collapse. Into this desperate theater of war came Yigal Allon. Now commanding the Palmach's Yiftach Brigade, an elite force forged in the crucible of clandestine operations, he was entrusted with a mission that seemed impossible. His orders were simple in their phrasing, but monumental in their scope. Secure the eastern Galilee. This meant breaking the sieges on isolated Jewish settlements and, above all, capturing Saft. The stakes were absolute. Standing before his officers, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, Allon made the reality of their task brutally clear. He reportedly told them, "We cannot afford to lose. The fate of the Galilee depends on us tonight." Allon surveyed the battlefield and knew a frontal assault on Saft was suicide. His Palmachniks were fearless, but they were vastly outnumbered and possessed no artillery to speak of. The Arab forces held the city's dominant positions, including the ancient citadel and the police fortress, transforming Saft into a formidable defensive bastion. A conventional battle would bleed his brigade dry and achieve nothing. He needed a different path, a strategy that would bypass the enemy's strengths and strike at their greatest weakness, their morale. His plan would be a masterclass in audacity, a gamble based not on firepower but on fear. Before he could even think of the city itself, Allon had to sever its lifelines. He launched a series of swift, hard-hitting attacks on the surrounding Arab villages. The Yiftach Brigade struck at Ain al-Zaytun and Berea, key positions that supplied and reinforced the Arab fighters in Safed. These operations were designed to isolate the city, to create a sense of encirclement and cut off any possibility of retreat or reinforcement. The message was clear: no help was coming. The defenders of Saft were on their own. This physical isolation was the first step in his psychological campaign. The centerpiece of Allon's plan was a strange and terrifying weapon. It was called the Davidka, a homemade mortar that was notoriously inaccurate. Its shells were little more than large metal casings packed with explosives, often flying in unpredictable arcs and landing far from their intended targets. But the Davidka's inaccuracy was irrelevant. Its true power was not in its explosive yield, but in its sound. When a Davidka shell was fired, it produced a deafening, earth-shattering roar that was said to sound like the sky itself was being torn apart. It was a weapon of pure psychological terror. Allon ordered his 3 precious Davidkas moved into position around Safed. Simultaneously, his intelligence officers began a carefully orchestrated campaign of disinformation. Palmach agents, fluent in Arabic, spread rumors throughout the Arab quarters and surrounding villages. They whispered of massive Jewish reinforcements on their way, of a secret new superweapon, an atomic bomb that would annihilate the city. The Davidka, they hinted, was this new weapon. The stories were designed to magnify the existing anxiety, to transform the unknown into something apocalyptic and inescapable. On the night of May 10th, a cold, driving rain began to fall over the Galilee mountains. The storm provided the perfect cover for Allon's final move. As darkness enveloped Saft, the tense silence was broken, not by rifle fire, but by a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The first Davidka shell exploded in the night, its thunderous boom echoing off the stone buildings and rolling through the narrow alleys. Then another and another. A Palmach soldier later recalled the moment. The noise was indescribable. It was not a normal explosion, it was a roar that shook your bones and made you believe the world was ending. We could hear the screaming begin almost immediately. Under the cover of the storm and the terrifying noise, Palmach units began to infiltrate the city. They moved silently through the rain-slicked streets, attacking key Arab positions. The combination was devastating. The defenders, already unnerved by their isolation and the rampant rumors, were now subjected to a terrifying, unseen bombardment. The monstrous sound of the Davidkas, which they believed to be the promised superweapon, shattered their will to fight. What began as confusion quickly escalated into mass panic. The much larger, better-armed Arab force did not conduct an orderly retreat. It simply collapsed. Soldiers and civilians alike fled in terror, abandoning their weapons and positions, desperate to escape the unseen destruction. By morning, the city was in Allon's hands. He had conquered one of the most strategic and heavily defended positions in the north with minimal casualties, not through superior firepower, but through sheer audacity and a profound understanding of the psychology of war. The Lion of Galilee had secured his first great victory, and with the fall of Safed, the entire eastern Galilee was secured for Israel. His victory in the north made him a national hero, a commander who could achieve the impossible. But the war was raging on multiple fronts. Now, David Ben-Gurion would call upon him for an even more critical task, to break the siege of the Negev and decide the fate of southern Israel. The triumphs in the Galilee were a fleeting reprieve from a state of total war. By late 1948, a new and far more dangerous front demanded Yigal Allon's attention. The south was on fire. Israel's most formidable adversary, the Egyptian army, had surged across the border, establishing a powerful wedge that severed the entire Negev from the rest of the nascent state. Dozens of Jewish settlements were isolated, besieged, their very existence hanging by a thread. The Egyptians, well-equipped and deeply entrenched, had created a seemingly impenetrable line of defense. The situation was critical, a strategic dagger pointed at the heart of Israel. In this moment of extreme peril, the High Command made a decisive choice. They appointed Allon commander of the entire southern front, a responsibility of staggering proportions. The green hills and narrow valleys of the north were gone, replaced by the vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert. This was a war of open spaces, of long supply lines and blistering heat, a war that demanded an entirely new doctrine. For Allon, this was the ultimate test of adaptability, a challenge to prove his genius was not confined to the terrain of his youth, but could master the art of war in any environment. But before he could confront the Egyptian army, a ghost from a few months prior haunted the strategic map. The road to Jerusalem was still vulnerable. His pivotal role in Operation Danny in July had already cemented his reputation as a commander who delivered decisive results. Leading the Yiftach Brigade, Allon was tasked with capturing the strategic Arab towns of Lod and Ramla. These were not mere villages. They were heavily defended urban centers that controlled the central plains and the primary artery to the besieged capital. The fighting was fierce, a brutal slog through streets and buildings, a stark contrast to the open field battles of the Palmach's early days. It required meticulous coordination between infantry, armored cars, and nascent air support. During the battle for Lod, eyewitnesses described Allon at a forward command post, a simple table set up in a dusty orchard. As Egyptian artillery shells screamed overhead, shaking the ground and sending shrapnel flying, he remained utterly composed. He calmly issued orders over the crackling radio, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos, adjusting troop movements and directing fire with an unnerving precision. His coolness under pressure was infectious, radiating confidence to his officers. The capture of Lod and Ramla was a monumental victory. It broke the siege on Jerusalem, secured the core of the new state, and demonstrated Allon's mastery of complex combined arms operations in a semi-urban battlefield. Now, as he took command in the south, he faced a force exponentially larger than his old brigade. He was no longer just a Palmach commander leading men he had known for years. He was the general of an entire front, commanding multiple brigades composed of Palmach veterans, new immigrants with minimal training, and soldiers from various underground backgrounds. Yet he refused to become a distant figure in a rear headquarters. Yigal Allon brought the soul of the Palmach with him to the desert. He rejected the stiff formalities of a conventional army, preferring a direct personal style of leadership. He would appear unannounced at forward positions, sharing a cup of coffee with sentries, asking about their families and listening to their concerns. He walked the front lines, studied the terrain with his own eyes, and insisted on understanding the battlefield from the perspective of the soldiers who would have to fight on it. This was not for show. It was a fundamental part of his command philosophy. He empowered his subordinate commanders, giving them clear objectives but allowing them the flexibility to achieve them. He fostered a climate of trust and initiative, knowing that in the fluid chaos of battle, the officer on the ground was often the best judge of the situation. This approach inspired a level of devotion that was legendary. His men knew he would never ask them to take a risk he was not willing to take himself. A comrade in arms later captured this unique bond perfectly, stating, "He was the commander who knew the name of every soldier, the man who led you into fire and you followed him without question, because you knew he was right there with you." This was the source of his authority. It was not derived from rank, but from respect earned in the crucible of combat. Standing on a sand dune, gazing at the seemingly static Egyptian lines stretching to the horizon, Allon's mind was already dissecting the new challenge, formulating a new way of war. He understood that the desert's emptiness was not a weakness, but an opportunity. It was a landscape made for movement, for speed, for the bold maneuver that could unhinge an entire army. He articulated his emerging doctrine with stark clarity. In the desert, he told his officers, the flank is everything. He who controls the flank controls the battle. It was a philosophy of surprise and mobility, a direct inheritance from his Palmach training, now scaled up for a theater of war that spanned hundreds of square kilometers. With the center of the country secured and the trust of his men absolute, Allon turned his gaze south to the entrenched Egyptian army. He was about to unleash an operation so daring it would shatter the enemy's front and secure the entire Negev for Israel. By October of 1948, the southern front had become a festering wound on the map of Israel. The Egyptian army, a formidable and well-equipped force, had driven a thick wedge across the Negev, completely isolating dozens of Jewish settlements. Their defensive line was a chain of fortified positions, running from the coast near Ashdod inland to the Judean hills. This iron wall cut the nascent state in two, choking its southern artery. At the heart of this network were powerful strongholds like the police fort at Iraq Suedan, a concrete monster that had repelled multiple Israeli assaults, each one costing precious lives. The morale of the troops was strained, their attacks blunted against an enemy that seemed immovable. In Tel Aviv, the mood within the general staff was grim. David Ben-Gurion, his patience worn thin by the stalemate, demanded a decisive breakthrough. The Negev could not be abandoned. It was the future heartland of the country, and its settlements were symbols of Zionist resolve. Every failed attack amplified the pressure. Every casualty report deepened the sense of crisis. The weight of this impossible problem, the task of breaking an unbreakable line, fell squarely upon the shoulders of one man, the 29-year-old commander of the Southern Front, Yigal Allon. He was expected to deliver a miracle where others had delivered only eulogies. The planning sessions were tense, filled with the ghosts of past failures. Senior officers, including the seasoned Yitzhak Sadeh, advocated for another direct assault, perhaps with more firepower or better coordination. Allon listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the map spread across the table. When it was his turn, he rejected the conventional wisdom that had led them to ruin. A colleague argued, "We have tried hitting the line at 5 different points. It is too strong. We will bleed ourselves dry." Allon calmly tapped a finger on a vast, empty expanse of desert east of the main Egyptian positions. He proposed a plan of breathtaking audacity, a maneuver so counterintuitive it bordered on madness. Instead of throwing his men against the fortified teeth of the Egyptian line, he would bypass them entirely. His strategy was a masterpiece of the indirect approach, attacking not the enemy's strength, but their mind. The plan was twofold. First, a commando battalion from the Negev Brigade would move under the cover of darkness, not to fight, but to build. Their mission was to carve a new road through the rough desert terrain, a secret passage that would circumvent the entire Egyptian front. This wedge road would be Israel's key, an invisible door into the enemy's rear. Once it was complete, the second phase would begin. An armored brigade, spearheaded by the new tanks and half-tracks of the 8th Armored Brigade, would slip through this passage during the night. They would not engage the main Egyptian line. Their objective was deeper, more vital. They would drive straight for Beersheba, the strategic headquarters of the entire Egyptian Expeditionary Force in Palestine. It was the nerve center, the logistical hub, the brain of the enemy's operation. Allon reasoned that a fortress is useless if its command is decapitated. He knew, as he often stated, the moral strength of the fighting man is the most important factor in the battlefield. By striking Beersheba, he aimed to shatter not just supply lines, but the enemy's will to fight. The execution of Operation Yoav began on the night of October 15th, while the newly formed Israeli Air Force bombed Egyptian airfields, and other Israeli units launched diversionary attacks along the main front. The real work began in the silent desert. Engineers and infantrymen worked with frantic, hushed intensity, clearing rocks and grading a path under a moonless sky. The air was thick with tension. A single Egyptian patrol could expose the entire operation. By dawn, a rough but passable track existed where only goat paths had been before. The first jeeps of the Negev Brigade's commando unit tested the new route, their headlights dimmed, engines whispering. They were the tip of the spear. Behind them, the armored columns began their slow, careful advance, a steel serpent winding its way deep into hostile territory. The gamble was enormous. If they were discovered, the entire brigade would be trapped and annihilated, far from any support. But they moved like ghosts, their presence completely unknown to the Egyptian command, which was focused on the noisy feints to their west. The radio call came just before dawn on October 21st, a simple coded message confirming the unthinkable. Israeli armor was on the outskirts of Beersheba. The Egyptian command was thrown into total confusion. Reports of tanks were dismissed as impossible fantasies. How could an Israeli army appear from the empty desert? The shock was absolute, the panic immediate. The attack on the city was a whirlwind of controlled violence. Israeli half-tracks roared into the town square, their machine guns suppressing the dazed and disorganized defenders. Street fighting was brief but intense. The surprised Egyptian garrison, composed mainly of lightly armed troops and a large contingent of Muslim Brotherhood volunteers, had no answer to the sudden, overwhelming assault. They had been preparing for a threat from the north, not a mechanized attack from their supposedly secure rear in the east. The city's defenses collapsed within hours. By 9 in the morning, the blue and white flag was flying over the main police station. The fall of Beersheba was a catastrophic blow to the Egyptians. The psychological impact was precisely what Allon had predicted. With their headquarters captured and their command structure shattered, the entire Egyptian front lost its cohesion. Units that had been dug into impregnable positions for months suddenly found themselves cut off, their supply lines severed, their orders non-existent. Panic spread like fire. Panic. The seemingly unbreakable line began to crumble, not from a frontal assault, but from a fatal blow to its heart. Operation Yoav was a stunning, decisive success. The Negev was liberated, and the road south was finally open. Allon had not just won a battle, he had redefined warfare for the young Israeli state. His audacity had turned a desperate stalemate into a strategic masterpiece. The Egyptians were broken and in full retreat, but they were not yet completely defeated. To secure the victory and force Cairo to the negotiating table, Allon knew he had to do more than just push them back. He had to trap them, and that meant taking the war across the border. The winter of 1948 descended upon the Negev, but the chill in the air did little to cool the final, simmering conflict of the war. The southern front was a bleeding wound, a persistent threat that Yigal Allon was determined to cauterize for good. The victories at Yoav and Lot had pushed the Egyptians back, but their main expeditionary force remained intact, a coiled serpent ready to strike again. A fragile truce was in place, but Allon and Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion knew it was merely a pause. The United Nations was debating sanctions, and intense diplomatic pressure emanated from London and Washington, demanding a permanent ceasefire. The political clock was ticking with furious speed, granting Israel one last, narrow window to secure its southern border. Ben-Gurion turned to the one commander he knew could finish the job. He gave Allon the green light for an operation of unprecedented audacity, codenamed Horev. The objective was no longer to simply liberate territory or relieve besieged settlements. The goal of Operation Horev was absolute: the complete encirclement and destruction of the Egyptian army in Palestine. It was a high-stakes gamble conceived to deliver a blow so decisive it would force Cairo to the negotiating table. Gathering his commanders in a makeshift desert headquarters, the dust swirling around their maps, Allon laid out his vision with cold clarity. His voice was low but carried an unwavering conviction that silenced all doubt. "We have pushed them back twice," he stated, his eyes scanning the faces of the men who would lead the charge. "This is not enough. We are not finishing the job until the threat is gone. This time, we go all the way." He knew the international community would erupt in protest, but time for diplomacy had run out. The future of the southern half of the new state would be decided by force of arms in the coming days. On the 22nd of December, under the cover of a harsh winter night, the offensive began. Allon unleashed his forces not in a predictable frontal assault, but with the cunning misdirection that had become his trademark. He feinted toward Gaza while his main armored columns, spearheaded by the 8th and Negev brigades, swung far to the east. They moved with astonishing speed across rugged, supposedly impassable terrain, guided by veteran Palmach scouts. They were a phantom army, appearing where no enemy intelligence thought possible. The Israeli forces slammed into the critical Egyptian rear positions at Auja, a vital crossroads controlling the primary route into the Sinai Peninsula. The defenders were caught completely by surprise, their command and control shattered in a swift, violent assault. With the gateway to Egypt now open, Allon made a fateful decision. He would not stop at the border. He unleashed his columns across the international frontier, a daring invasion of sovereign Egyptian territory. This was a strategic roll of the dice that risked provoking direct British military intervention, as Britain had a defense treaty with Egypt. But Allon calculated that speed was his greatest ally. He bypassed heavily fortified Egyptian positions along the border, leaving them isolated and irrelevant, cut off from their supply lines. His columns were not an army of occupation. They were a rapier thrust aimed at the enemy's heart. They raced deep into the vast, empty expanse of the Sinai Desert, a landscape that had swallowed armies for millennia. The soldiers, pushed to the limits of human endurance, drove relentlessly through the biting cold of the desert nights and the glaring sun of the days. The target was El Arish, the main administrative and logistical hub for the entire Egyptian expeditionary force. Its airfield was the critical artery through which supplies and reinforcements flowed. To capture El Arish would be to strangle the Egyptian army in the Gaza Strip. Israeli armor and motorized infantry materialized from the desert haze, sowing panic and confusion. Egyptian commanders, receiving frantic reports of Israeli forces deep in their rear, could not comprehend what was happening. Their maps showed the main Israeli strength far to the north. Yet here they were, a ghost army at their doorstep, severing communications and ambushing supply convoys. Allon was orchestrating a masterpiece of mobile warfare, a blitzkrieg that would be studied by military academies for decades to come. He was in total command, a master of a multi-brigade orchestra, playing a symphony of destruction across a theater of war larger than the entire state of Israel. The climax of the operation arrived with breathtaking speed. While his armored spearheads drove on El Arish, other Israeli units closed the trap behind the main Egyptian force. They captured key junctions and high ground, sealing off all avenues of retreat. An entire Egyptian brigade, including its charismatic Sudanese commander, was now completely surrounded in what became known as the Fallujah Pocket. Allon's forces stood on the outskirts of El Arish, its airfield within their grasp. The total annihilation of the Egyptian army in the region was not just possible, it was imminent. Victory was absolute, a triumph beyond the wildest dreams of the Israeli high command just weeks earlier. His soldiers, exhausted but exhilarated, prepared for the final assault. It was at this moment of ultimate triumph that the message came. A crackling radio transmission from Tel Aviv, carrying not congratulations but a direct, unassailable order from Ben-Gurion himself. The word was simple: halt, withdraw all forces from Egyptian territory immediately. Allon stood in his command jeep, the desert wind whipping at his face, the message receiver cold in his hand. He was stunned. Rage and disbelief washed over him. He argued, pleaded, and explained that total victory was hours away, a victory that would secure the South for a generation. But the decision was final. He could not know the full extent of the storm he had unleashed. In London, the British government had delivered a blunt ultimatum to the Israeli ambassador: withdraw from the Sinai, or the Royal Air Force would intervene to enforce the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. The United States, fearing a wider regional war, added its own immense pressure. Ben-Gurion, the politician, had been forced to override Allon, the general. He could not risk a direct war with the British Empire. The order stood. For Allon, it was the most bitter moment of his military career. To be so close to a history-altering victory, only to have it snatched away by political necessity, was an agony deeper than any battlefield wound. He watched with immense frustration as his tank columns, poised on the brink of their final objective, turned their engines around. They rumbled back across the Sinai border, leaving their prize untouched. The military campaign was over, a stunning success cut short at its zenith. Yet the blow had been decisive. The Egyptian high command, having seen its army encircled and its strategic depth penetrated so effortlessly, was shattered. The Sinai Gambit, though politically neutered, had broken Egypt's will to fight. Within days, Cairo signaled its readiness to begin armistice negotiations. He had won the war and drawn the borders of the state with his genius. But for Yigal Allon, the hero of the battlefield, the most painful battle was yet to come, and it would be fought not against an enemy army, but within the halls of power of the nation he helped create. The guns of the War of Independence had fallen silent, but in the corridors of power, a new battle was just beginning. The nation had been secured, yet its soul was being forged in the fires of political conflict. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, the patriarch of the state, was determined to consolidate power and build a single, unified Israeli defense forces. To him, the very existence of the Palmach, with its independent command structure and fierce loyalty to the socialist Mapam party, was an intolerable anomaly. He saw it not as an elite fighting force, but as a private army, a potential threat to the state's authority. He believed that for Israel to survive, it needed one army, under one government, with one unquestionable loyalty. This conviction set him on a collision course with the Palmach's most celebrated commander, Yigal Allon. The simmering tensions erupted in what became known as the Generals' Revolt. It was not a military coup, but a crisis of command. Ben-Gurion, seeking to centralize control, began systematically dismantling the Palmach's headquarters and reassigning its officers. Allon and other senior commanders, men who had just led Israel to a miraculous victory, felt their strategic wisdom was being dismissed and their life's work unraveled for purely political reasons. They argued that Ben-Gurion's decisions were weakening the army at a critical time. They saw the dissolution of the Palmach not as a move toward national unity, but as a partisan purge by Ben-Gurion's Mapai party against its Mapam rivals. It was a clash of titans. The nation's founding father, driven by a vision of absolute state control, against its most brilliant young general, fighting to preserve the spirit and structure that had won the war. The conflict was deep, personal, and profoundly ideological, a struggle over the very character of the new Israeli state. The final confrontation was inevitable and brutal. Despite his unparalleled battlefield successes, Allon's association with the Palmach and Mapam made him a political liability in Ben-Gurion's eyes. The Prime Minister summoned the young commander, then the head of the Southern Command, for a meeting. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken history and political weight. Ben-Gurion, the elder statesman, was resolute and uncompromising. He did not accuse Allon of disloyalty, but of embodying a separate power center that the state could no longer afford. He offered Allon a choice that was no choice at all: accept a subordinate study post abroad or leave the army. It was a clear, unambiguous message. Your time is over. At just 32 years old, the man who had conquered the Negev and driven the Egyptians from Palestine was being forced into retirement. The blow was immense, a personal and professional tragedy that cut to the core of Allon's identity. This was not a career change, it was an exile. He had dedicated his entire adult life to the defense of his people, rising from a teenage Haganah member to the most effective field commander of the war. Now, the very state he fought to create was casting him aside. The quiet moment of Allon clearing his office was the somber end of a legendary military career. He packed away maps that charted his victories, mementos from fallen comrades, and the uniform that had become his second skin. The pain was sharpened by the knowledge that his rivals, men like Moshe Dayan, who were more politically aligned with Ben-Gurion, would now rise to lead the Israeli Defense Forces he had done so much to shape. The hero of the war was being sidelined, a victim of the peace he had helped secure. For many men, such a public and painful dismissal would have been the end. They would have retreated into bitterness or obscurity, a footnote in the history they helped write. But Yigal Allon was not like other men. His unwavering dedication to Israel was not contingent on titles or uniforms. He processed the profound injustice not with rage, but with a quiet, steely resolve to find a new way to serve. Instead of fading away, he channeled his formidable energy and intellect into preparing for a different kind of battle. He made the extraordinary decision to leave Israel and enroll at St. Antony's College, Oxford University. The kibbutznik and soldier went to study philosophy, politics, and economics, deliberately broadening his horizons beyond the battlefield. This period was a deliberate and strategic pivot. In the hallowed halls of Oxford, Allon retooled himself, transforming the skills of a military strategist into those of a statesman. He learned the language of international diplomacy and political theory, preparing for the next phase of his service. He had once reminded his people that a state is not handed to a people on a silver platter, a quote that now took on a new personal meaning. He understood that the struggle to build and perfect the state was an internal one as well, fought in parliament and ministries as fiercely as it was fought in the desert sands. Upon his return to Israel, he was a changed man, equipped with new knowledge but the same core passion. He entered the Knesset, Israel's parliament, trading his military fatigues for a legislator's suit. The soldier was gone, but the servant of Israel remained, ready to fight for his country's future in the political arena. Though he had traded his uniform for a suit, the mind of the brilliant strategist never ceased working. For the rest of his life, Yigal Allon would apply the same audacity he showed on the battlefield to the even more complex arena of peace, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape Israel today. The battlefield victories of 1948 did not mark the end of Yigal Allon's service, but rather the beginning of a new, more complex chapter. He transitioned from the military uniform to the political arena, becoming a central figure in the Labour Party for 3 decades. His strategic mind, once focused on battlefield tactics, was now applied to the grand strategy of state building. He served in a succession of senior ministerial roles, but his most critical contributions came during Israel's darkest hours. In the tense weeks leading up to the Six-Day War in 1967, Allon was a powerful voice in the Security Cabinet. Drawing on his deep military experience, he was a major proponent of a preemptive strike, arguing that waiting for an Arab attack would be a catastrophic mistake. His calm, reasoned analysis helped persuade a deeply anxious government to take the decisive action that would reshape the Middle East. 6 years later, the nation faced an even greater existential threat. During the surprise attack of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Allon was a key member of Prime Minister Golda Meir's inner war cabinet. In the initial days of shock and near collapse, while others wavered, Allon remained a pillar of strategic calm. He was an anchor of stability, his mind methodically dissecting the disastrous intelligence failure and formulating a path forward. He worked tirelessly alongside military leaders, helping to orchestrate the daring counteroffensive that turned the tide of the war. His presence in that small, smoke-filled room was a critical element in steering the nation from the brink of annihilation to a hard-won, transformative victory. The warrior who had secured Israel's birth was now instrumental in ensuring its survival against overwhelming odds. He understood both the price of hesitation and the mechanics of recovery. Following the stunning victory of 1967, Allon immediately recognized that military triumph was not a permanent solution. He believed that holding on to all the captured territories with their large Arab populations would pose a long-term demographic and moral challenge to a Jewish and democratic state. It was here that the general became a visionary statesman. He drafted what would become his most significant political legacy, the Allon Plan. This was not a politician's abstract dream, but a soldier's pragmatic blueprint for peace. It was a masterpiece of strategic thinking applied to diplomacy, aiming to reconcile Israel's non-negotiable security needs with the principle of territorial compromise. He conceived of a future where peace was built on defensible borders, not just on paper agreements. The core of the Allon Plan was both simple and profound. Israel would annex a strip of territory along the Jordan River, creating a strategic security buffer in the Jordan Valley to prevent any future invasion from the east. It would also retain control over key strategic areas and a united Jerusalem. However, the plan called for returning the most densely populated areas of the West Bank, home to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, to Arab control, likely forming an autonomous entity connected to Jordan. This framework was designed to provide security without permanent occupation. It was Allon's answer to the great dilemma facing Israel: how to remain secure, Jewish, and democratic. The plan became the bedrock of Labor Party policy for years and remains a foundational concept in the ongoing debate over a two-state solution. Yigal Allon's life of service came to a sudden and tragic end in February 1980. He suffered a fatal heart attack at his home in Kibbutz Ginosar, the place where he was most at peace, overlooking the Sea of Galilee he so loved. His death sent a shockwave across Israel, a nation that saw him as one of its last true founding fathers. His legacy was threefold, a perfect trinity of creation, defense, and vision. He was the architect of the Palmach, instilling an ethos of initiative, daring, and camaraderie that became the DNA of the Israeli Defense Forces. He was the military genius of the War of Independence, the commander whose bold campaigns secured the nation's borders from the Galilee to the Negev. And finally, he was the forward-thinking statesman who spent the second half of his life trying to build a lasting peace. He understood better than anyone that military strength alone could not guarantee Israel's future. His efforts were driven by a profound desire to prevent future wars, famously stating, "We must not pursue a policy that would make weeping a national sport." He carried the memory of every fallen soldier and was determined to build a country where their sacrifice would not be in vain. His passing was mourned by the entire nation, but perhaps most poignantly by his former subordinate, Yitzhak Rabin. At the funeral, a grieving Rabin spoke of Allon, not just as a political colleague, but as "my commander," a mentor who had shaped his own journey from soldier to leader. Beyond the memorials and the streets named in his honor, Allon's living legacy endures. It is found in the doctrine of the Israeli Defense Forces, in the expectation that commanders lead from the front with the cry of, "Follow me." Hey, it resides in the tactical flexibility and operational audacity that he first championed in the Palmach. His connection to the land was not merely strategic, it was deeply personal. A passionate amateur archaeologist, he loved to explore the hills of the Galilee, unearthing the physical history that proved the Jewish people's ancient bond to their homeland. This deep-rooted love for the land and its history fueled his lifelong mission. Yigal Allon was a man who built his country twice. First with a rifle and a map, securing its existence in a crucible of fire, and then with a pen and a vision, charting a course toward a future of strength and peace.